Hello, I'm Nicholas Henshaw, I'm the Vicar of Groombridge here in East Sussex, and this is part of our Lent course. This is kind of an interlude, if you like. I hope it's helpful, in that I love it that some of the groups and individuals have been getting back to me with some questions. Always good to ask questions, and it doesn't matter, there's no foolish questions, only stupid answers, so that's my problem. And I've got 3 questions this week that I've been asked by groups and individuals, and I'll try and skip through those because I want to get on with the Gospel of Matthew, which will be a separate video, I promise. Otherwise, I'll run out of space. So the first question I've been asked is, why do the disciples not get it? Why is that a feature of Mark's Gospel? Well, we've examined that as a theme, and there were theories, if you go back 150 years ago, saying this was the messianic secret. It was terribly important for nobody to know. That didn't really make much sense. What I suggested when we talked about Mark the other week was that actually what Mark's getting across here, and I would just suggest this is rooted in the experience of the first followers of Jesus, is that nobody did get who Jesus was. Nobody did get who Jesus was. As we've said, the first person who properly gets it in Mark's Gospel is the pagan centurion, the pagan soldier who stands beside Jesus' cross and watches him die. He says, "This truly is the Son of God," or was the Son of God. There is a moment, of course, in the Gospels where Peter does say, "You are the Messiah," but immediately he gets it wrong again. So yeah, Peter glimpses something, but doesn't quite make the breakthrough. And of course, other ones, James and John are the classic example, aren't they? They say, "Lord, let's sit on the right and left of you when you come in your glory." And Jesus says, well, it's just not like that. You know, kings may rule it over each other and so forth and wield authority, but it is not so among you. The greatest among you is the servant. So I'd suggest it's all part and parcel of who Jesus is, that they don't get it. Let's put that in some perspective in terms of the Old Testament. The Old Testament has an increasing sense as the centuries move on, and especially after the Babylonian exile, that the people are longing for a new king like David, a new leader like Moses. And that becomes a kind of longing, this sense of surely somebody can take us out of this mess. Babylonian exile is then followed, yes, by the rebuilding of the temple, but that's very controversial. There are warring versions of what they should be doing next. And then, of course, some 200 years before Jesus is born, it comes the Roman occupation. And instead of being their homeland, this becomes an occupied people with an alien power. Okay, giving them some freedom of religion and thought, but actually deeply oppressive. The Roman regime was very much, we're in charge, you can do what you want, but within some very, very clear boundaries. And so that really exacerbates this deep sense of longing for salvation, longing for a new narrative. In books like Daniel, and many would suggest that Daniel is one of the latest books written in the Old Testament, that begins to become focused on a heavenly divine figure, one who will come and get them out of all this mess. So that in second and first century Judaism before Jesus, there is this sense of something's got to change and we don't know how to do it. But of course, there are some people saying we do know how to do it. It's armed uprising. There are zealots and others who see this as the opportunity, although one that would be very difficult to pull off, to actually turn the tables on the Romans. Jesus is born into a whole set of possible different expectations about what the world should look like. Well, no change there. And as Jesus begins to exercise his ministry as teacher, as healer, as the one we know to be the Son of God, God coming among us, then, of course, people project all sorts of things onto him. But the one thing that's puzzling very clearly, even to Peter, is that he's not acting like the Messiah. Yes, he's preaching. Yes, he's teaching. He's doing miracles of healing. He's raising up people's spirits. But there's no sense that this person is going to set themselves against the occupying power. Yes, Jesus from the very beginning annoys the religious elites, but kind of that's what these quirky people do in every age and time, isn't it? So they can kind of cope with that. Yeah, he's not on the side of the religious elite. We kind of think that's a good thing. But surely he's the person who's going to lead us and liberate us from the Roman occupation. Now, I don't know how far we can go with that. The historical evidence is all over the place, possibly. But it's very clear there's something like that going on, I'd suggest. And of course, that's focused particularly on the person of Judas. Now, we cannot delve into the mind of Judas. The biographies of Jesus don't give us that kind of information. Of course, we'd long to have it. But in the person of Judas, we have almost certainly, it would seem to me, a northerner to start with, just like me, except Manchester's not quite in the Holy Land, who, as far as we can see, really wants Jesus to be this person who he isn't, this person who's going to be the leader who can overturn the current political situation. And Judas himself betrays Jesus for that and, of course, ends up dying for that. And that's a real tragedy. But you can sort of see why he misunderstood, because Jesus is modelling a very, very different kind of Messiah. Let's take Palm Sunday. That's the classic example, what we call Palm Sunday, when Jesus enters Jerusalem and knowing, because he's prophesied it 3 times, that this is where he's going to die. So, they should have got something was going on, but they haven't quite, the penny hasn't dropped yet. He's greeted by the crowds waving palms and saying, "Alleluia, here comes the blessed is the name of the Lord, the King who comes in the name of the Lord," quoting from the Psalms. But of course, what Jesus is doing is something that they would immediately recognise, but we wouldn't necessarily. He's, if you like, acting out a scene from one of the prophets, Zechariah, who says, "Look, your king is coming to you lowly and riding on an ass." Now, the point about asses is people don't ride them. They're beasts of burden. It's the wrong thing for somebody to ride, and a king should not be on that animal. And he's lowly, he's humble. Oh, right. So Palm Sunday is a real trigger moment, it seems to me, where everybody begins to think, oh, right, he's this, even if he thinks he's the Messiah, that's not what Messiahs do. Messiahs are all about power and might. They're about the people who are going to take on the Romans and do something different. And along with all sorts of other moments in the Gospels, Old Testament texts are really important because Jesus takes them, like the suffering servant in Isaiah, that this is one who was bruised for our transgressions, humiliated. All right. So this isn't quite the Messiah we were thinking. So even people who might think Jesus was the Messiah are kind of thinking, right, but he's not doing all the things we're expecting. And he does sort of things like, hang around with the wrong people and, heal lepers. And that's all a good thing to do, but it's not quite what we were expecting. So I don't think it's about the disciples being prevented from seeing who Jesus is, but that's simply a reflection of the experience of the gospel writer, that they didn't get it. They simply didn't get it. And that's important, because what Mark tells us in his very dramatic and excited language is that, gosh, the only person who did get it was the pagan Roman standing by his cross. So that's the first one. Well, in fact, I've answered the second one in the same way. Why were the disciples prevented from understanding who Jesus was? And why? Well, because that's the nature of the narrative. That's exactly. And of course, what Mark's inviting us to recognise is that we must not be blind in the same way. That poem by Woodbine Willie, "When Jesus came to Birmingham, they only passed him by." Yes, that's a big deal. Would we recognise the Christ if he walked into our church on Sunday morning? Well, he does walk into our church every Sunday morning, because he is the brother, the sister, the person on the way, the wounded guy by the street side, the person who need of bread. That is our brother, our sister, and our mother, as Jesus says elsewhere in the gospel. The third question is really fascinating, and I'm not sure I understand it, so I hope I answer it correctly. What evidence is there to say that Jesus was demonically tainted? Well, if I understand this question at all, I'm going to turn it around the other way, because I don't think there is any evidence that Jesus was demonically tainted. I think it's kind of the other way round, and I think the first chapters of Mark's Gospel are really good for this, really, really helpful. Because Jesus is God, because Jesus is the Messiah, whatever people fail to see, because Jesus is, then Jesus' presence brings out all the dark stuff. And it seems to me that's what's going again, where the demon in the first or second chapter of Mark, who says, I know who you are, I know who you are. And they're screeching out, they're really furious. Now, okay, language about demons and darkness is really hard for us because we don't quite have the right language to get that right, and we have too many horror films that get it hopelessly wrong. But there's a real sense in Mark's Gospel, as in throughout the New Testament, that Jesus is confronting really, really bad human evil. And sometimes that human evil is located in places, in people, in situations, but he is confronting that all the time. And rather like, well, there are all sorts of contexts we can understand this, can't we? When we come into the presence of a really holy person, we sometimes think, wow, gosh, who am I? And I think what happens is Jesus' presence, especially in places where stuff isn't right, provokes, if you like, provokes those things emerging from the underbelly of the human darkness which so many of us live in. And so I don't think it's Jesus who is tainted by evil. I think Jesus' very presence confronts evil. And I would say in my own experience as a priest over nearly 35, 36 years now, that's exactly my experience, that again and again, the presence of Christ, often through his representatives and through the life of the church and through worship, actually enables people to begin to grapple with the darkest versions of themselves. And sometimes that can be what we might even describe as demonic, a word I don't use lightly. But there can be moments, and I've had them in my own experience, where that is what you feel you're confronted with. And the armoury you have there is simply seeking to be most deeply present as Christ is present for us in every day. I think there's another bit here which I think is really interesting to toy with. Now, not so much found in Mark's Gospel, but very much in Luke's Gospel, and indeed in other bits of the Gospels, is this extraordinary reality that Jesus chooses to allow himself to become unclean so that he's standing on the side of the poor, the outcast, and the broken. Now, this is really extraordinary. Let me use a really good example from Luke's Gospel. Now, Luke's Gospel, this is a unique story in Luke's Gospel, where Jesus is approaching the town of Nain, 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 and a widow is part of a funeral cortege for her only son. And what does Jesus do? Well, he does something quite remarkable. He puts out his hand and goes towards where the bier on which the son is lying. Now, interestingly, the phrase Luke uses there is exactly the phrase that he uses of what Jesus does on the Mountain of the Transfiguration when he goes towards a totally confused Peter. He goes towards him and touches him. So there's something very interesting. Luke's language is really important there. But the fascinating thing in the Widow of Nain's son story is that by touching the dead body, or even touching the bier, B-I-E-R, on which the lad is lying, Jesus becomes ritually unclean. Now that's extraordinary. So Jesus is happy to cross over a line. As a friend of mine used to say, whenever I find a line in the sand, Jesus is already on the other side of it. That seems to me very clear, particularly in Luke's Gospel, that Jesus chooses to, if you like, go over to the other side. I don't mean become evil. I don't mean that at all. No. His goodness and power as God made one of us, God become flesh, is able to take on that burden of darkness. And of course, inevitably, just very quickly now, that is something we see at the crucifixion. We have so many images of the crucifixion that may confuse us here, but one of the themes that we probably often miss is that in the Jewish law, Deuteronomy, one who is hanged on a wooden stake becomes a curse, is cursed. And I think that's actually a really important part of our understanding of the crucifixion, that Jesus, there are all sorts of metaphors we use this, Jesus taking upon himself the sins of the whole world. Yes, he chooses to cross that line and become a curse for us. So I don't think he's demonically compromised or any of that at all. Indeed, he's invulnerable in a sense to all of that, because he is the Lord of all, the one who holds creation itself in the palm of his hands. And yet he chooses to cross that line. Now, I think that's really important, because again and again, he allows himself to be touched by a bleeding woman. He touches lepers. He hangs around with unclean people. He chooses to be with the scum of the earth, so to speak. And that tells us something extraordinary about the different kind of Messiah Jesus is showing himself to be. To be continued. Do ask more questions. Do let them come in. And in the next video, we'll be exploring Matthew's Gospel.